In this lesson, we'll take a look at linking and transitive verbs so that we can better understand the object of our sentence. So we learned, right, that an English sentence has a subject, a verb, and then an object. Now, I wish it was that easy, but it's not quite that simple, okay? In the beginning of this course, I told you subject, verb, object, just to introduce to you the main way that we form sentences. But when we get more advanced, really that object isn't always an object like we think it is. So there are sentences that can be made without an object, okay? Or there are sentences that have more than one object, or there are sentences where it looks like an object, but actually we don't consider it an object. So in this lesson, we're going to go over those different types. To understand this, we will focus mainly on 3 different types of sentences. And the sentence is different due to the way we use the verb. So these 3 types of verbs are transitive verb, okay? And transitive verb can be broken down into the monotransitive verb and ditransitive verb. We'll go look at intransitive verbs and finally linking verbs. So, transitive verbs. These are the sentences that we started talking about, okay? In the beginning, I said all sentences have a subject, verb, and object. Now, while that maybe wasn't 100% true, I said it because it's best to think in that way. So, when we think about a sentence that always has a subject, verb, and object, these are sentences that are using a verb in the transitive verb format, okay? And the transitive verbs can be broken into 2 categories. The monotransitive sentences, which are subject, verb, object, okay? And then the ditransitive sentences, which are subject, verb, indirect object, and then direct object. So here we actually have 2 objects. If we look at these in terms of real sentences, we can look at these following examples. So the monotransitive sentences, okay, these are very easy to understand. Jeff kicked the ball. Here, Jeff is our subject. The verb is kicked, and the object is ball. Okay? Here, we have a true object. Why? Because the action from the verb is being transferred from the subject to the object. So Jeff kicked the ball. Okay, so these are all related. There's a connection. The ditransitive sentences, okay, will have this subject, verb, indirect object, and finally, direct object. So you see here, Jeff gave Dan the cake. So here, we have Jeff is our subject. Our verb is gave, okay? The indirect object is Dan, and the direct object is the cake. So in this sentence, if we took out our indirect object, we would still have a monotransitive sentence, right? Jeff gave the cake. So that's how we know the cake is our direct object. The cake is receiving the action. And who is the action going to, right? Who did Jeff give the cake to? Well, he gave it to Dan. So that is our indirect object. So a little bit more on direct and indirect objects. But direct objects are just the nouns or pronouns that are receiving the action, okay? While the indirect objects are the nouns or pronouns affected by the action. So think of it this way. Indirect objects are the recipients of the direct object. And the indirect object is always going to answer that question, from whom, okay, or to whom, for whom, or for what. So again, now we can look at our examples. Jeff gave Dan the cake. So Jeff, our subject, the verb is gave, okay? The cake is receiving the action, gave, right? The cake is being given. Who is affected by this action though? Well, Dan is affected by it, right? Dan is getting this cake. So the indirect object, Dan, is the recipient of the direct object, the cake. Okay? We have another sentence here. Max pitched Alice the baseball. So again, Max, okay, subject. Pitched is our verb. What did Max pitch? Well, he pitched the baseball. So that is the thing that is receiving the action. But who was affected by this action? Well, Alice was affected. So Alice is our indirect object. So these are these ditransitive sentences. They have two objects actually. Okay, so now we're moving on to a different sentence type, and here we're going to start breaking the rule that we talked about at the beginning of the course. These are sentences that don't actually have a real object. Okay, now in the beginning of the course, I used some of these sentences and said they did have an object, but that was just to simplify the introduction of this course. Now we're going to actually look at what these sentences have and what they don't have. So these intransitive verbs have no real object. That means that their action is not transferred from a subject to an object. Okay? It's not transferred from a subject to an object. So these intransitive verbs will have this following structure. We'll have a subject plus a verb. Okay? Many times that's it, just the subject and verb. And that is fine. That can be considered a complete sentence. Sometimes though, you'll have these extra words, this prepositional phrase at the end. So if we look at these examples here, she cried, okay, that's an intransitive sentence. Even though it has no object, it's fine because the way we're using the verb, okay, being used in an intransitive way. She cried. We can also add more information, and there's still not an object. She cried at home. Okay? At home is a prepositional phrase. It is not the object, actually, because the home is not receiving the crying, right? At home is just where she cried. So this isn't considered an object. And again, we can follow these intransitive verbs with other words, and they're not the object. They just tell us things like how, where, or when. Okay? But they're not really the object. So, he slept after dinner. We could end the sentence with just, he slept. And that would be an intransitive sentence. But after dinner is not our object, right? Dinner is not receiving the sleeping. After dinner is just telling us when. Okay, when did he sleep? He slept after dinner. Here, our car blew up down the street. Right? Our car is the subject. Blew up is the verb. Okay? But down the street is just a prepositional phrase, right? It is not an actual true object. And the last type of sentence we'll talk about, okay, is a linking verb sentence. And these sentences don't have an object. They have something different called a subject complement. So the linking verbs use a verb that link two parts of a sentence, and those two parts are the subject, okay, and the subject complement. And the subject complement would be a noun or some type of adjective. So here's the basic structure: subject, verb, subject complement. And here's our example sentence: Eric is a doctor, right? So here we're using a linking verb. There's no action. So we're not putting any action on this word here, a doctor, right? Eric is a doctor. This is a linking verb sentence.